What is up, night crawlers? Welcome back to the Nightmare's Edge. Thank you for being here tonight. I truly appreciate you doing so. Tonight, I present the first two parts of a 4-part series written by DarkHeroxx. The stories are entitled, I Saw Hell in a Hospital Hallway, and I Saw Hell in the Hospital's West Wing. Thank you, DarkHeroxx, for allowing me to read them. The links to the stories and his socials are going to be listed in the description. Be sure to check them out. Now, sit back, relax, and let me tickle your inner fears. I saw hell in the hospital hallway. Sorry in advance for the long post. I'll be calling myself Sarah, and I work in a hospital in upstate New York as a nurse. I was originally from Pennsylvania, but just recently moved towards the Big Apple for a change of pace and scenery. I love doing my job because I genuinely love helping people. But some things started happening here recently that has made me rethink my plans of staying here. There are tons of stories at the hospital I work at. There's one story of a man who was admitted one evening because he collapsed at his construction job. When a doctor came to examine him, he told the man he would have to stay a while to run some tests. While time passed, he had gotten much worse. He could barely breathe and he was in immense pain. When the results finally came back, they told the man that he had asbestos, a condition that scars the lungs from breathing in asbestos fibers from his work. Unfortunately, that was not uncommon back then. Well, the man didn't take the news very well. He was in pain, and he didn't want to allow the disease to eat at him any longer. It was later that night when he walked towards his door and looked to see if the hallways were empty. There was an eerie silence around him and no other signs of life in his vicinity. The man proceeded to get on his knees and place his neck on the door frame. Using all of his strength, the man proceeded to slam the wooden door onto his neck, over and over and over. Slam, 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 crack. It was an instant, and the man was in a crazed stupor as he continuously slammed the door onto his neck. Blood splattered everywhere as the sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking filled the hallways. His labored breaths began to gurgle as his throat began to fill with crimson. A short time later, some nurses had found his mess of a body, and their screams carried into the night. Apparently that floor isn't used anymore, and you can still hear the door slam. I've been there and done that. I get it, it's fun to scare the newbies when they arrive, especially the ones on night shift. I'm sure this place has some history, but I doubted the existence of the supernatural wandering the hospital. At first, when they told me about the ghosts, I chuckled and brushed it off. But when my CNO, Chief Nursing Officer, insisted for me to be careful my first shift, I thought I'd pretend to take it a bit more seriously. I ended up going weeks without experiencing a single thing aside from the normal crazy of just working in a hospital, especially during COVID. With the massive influx of patients following the pandemic, we had to clean up and open every room that we had, even the previously mentioned unused floor. It was one night I was going through the halls and I had to investigate a noise. It was a weekend during the absolute craziness of the pandemic, and we were all being spread thin. We all had to go to areas we usually don't go to, but it was okay. We were all focused on getting these patients situated. I was taking care of an area that didn't have any COVID patients. This was the floor we recently opened up. We had a patient who I'll call Jack, an older gentleman who was brought in because he had some chest pains. I came into Jack's room one night and he asked me if I could give him anything to help him sleep. When he first came in a few days ago, he was extremely bright and chipper despite his condition, but tonight he was pale and shaking. That concerned me, and I asked him if his chest pains were keeping him up at night, and he just looked at me with small tears forming in the corners of his eyes. He shuddered as he told me someone keeps coming into his room at night. This was my first time hearing about anything like this, so I asked if he could tell me more. Jack downcast his eyes as he began to rub his shaking hands together. He told me that late at night, he could hear his door open and slam shut. He would wake up and see a dark figure crawling towards him. Now I asked if it was another nurse that we had, but Jack was sure it wasn't them. Jack described the figure as a large man with short white hair. His mouth was open and he said that blood was slowly trickling out of it. He began to shiver a bit as he continued to describe what he saw. Jack continued by telling me that the man was in an old hospital gown, but it was worn with spatters of blood on it. He began to close his eyes as he told me that the man's neck was crooked and broken. The flesh on the neck was torn open to reveal shattered bone. I felt sorry for the man. I assumed that he had more issues than just chest pains, so I assured him I would get someone to check off something that would help him. I had to make my rounds to check on the other patients, but I told him I would check on him again soon. As I closed the door, I could hear him quickly shuffle back onto his bed. I made my way around the hall towards the other patients. They all complained about losing sleep, not from a man visiting them at night, but the sound of a door slamming in the hallway. I talked to some of the other nurses about it, and their faces were in absolute shock. They didn't want to listen to any more and told me I shouldn't be trying to scare them. I didn't know what else to do, but maybe it was just a coincidence. After forcing down a can of Red Bull and a cup of coffee, I looked at my watch. It was around 3 a.m., so I wanted to go and check on the patients. I walked towards the elevator and pressed the button to go up towards the old floor. I forced a laugh as I remembered Jack's account of the man he saw, one of the old stories about the man who killed himself, and a few other tales the nurses had told me. I didn't want to scare myself, but the description of the figure and the fear I saw in Jack's eyes, that very fear began to slowly sink into me. The elevator doors slowly creaked open, and I was met with a dimly lit hallway. We had to save on power, so late at night we wouldn't have all the lights on. As I walked towards the hall, the lights began to flicker. The fluorescent lamps began to buzz as my footsteps slowly echoed through the hall. I saw something at the end of the hall from one of the rooms, Jack's room. Something was peering at me from the bottom of the doorway. Only the top of the head was visible, but I was able to make out a thin tuft of white hair atop a man's head. As the lights flicked, the flashes of light hit their face, and I could see their eyes glowing white. I could hear my breath begin to shudder as I stared towards the head, and I could hear another breath. It sounded as if someone was taking short breaths while submerged in water. The quick inhales were low, and I could hear something snap with each labored breath. I jumped as a sudden slam erupted from the direction, and suddenly another, and another. The sound of a door slamming began to echo throughout the hallway, and each time it slammed, I could hear something squish, something snap, something tear. I wanted to let out a scream, but nothing would come out. Was I having some kind of waking nightmare? Hallucination? Has my mind conjured some sort of phantom from all those damn stories? Before I was able to let out my own, a yell could be heard down the hallway from Jack's room. His cry of terror made my blood run cold as ice. Then another scream, and another, all coming from the other patients' rooms. The sound came rushing towards me, a dark symphony of horrified cries resonating into my skull. My legs shook and I fell onto my knees, trying desperately to mute the sound by covering my ears. My head was ringing and I felt blood running down my nostrils. Tears began to flood my eyes, and when I screamed, I couldn't hear anything at all. I was completely drowned in screams. I looked forward and I saw the head slowly move out of the doorway. When it fully emerged from Jack's room, I could see that it was indeed an old hospital gown. It was on the floor, propping itself up on its legs and arms. Each limb was bending in an inhuman way, like the legs of a spider, the way the joints shot up and bent downwards. The figure's head was bent, broken, and it swayed back and forth as its eyes flashed white from the flickering of the lights. It splatters dark red blood onto the walls. It was looking towards me with its mouth slack-jawed. Despite being surrounded by screams, I could faintly hear its blood-soaked inhales. It just stared at me, and I began to slowly shuffle backwards toward the elevator doors. That's when it began to step towards me, and each time it got closer, the dimming lights behind it would pop and shatter. It crept towards me, slowly, while the darkness followed behind it. I was sure I was in hell at this point, as the screams got louder, the figure creeping closer, and the darkness covering the hallway. It was only a few feet away from me now. Its limbs groaned and cracked as it moved closer and closer. I'll never forget how its white eyes stayed fixed upon me as its broken neck swayed back and forth, with its jaw hanging down to reveal a small flow of blood. My back was completely on the elevator door, and it was so close to me. It began to scramble over me. Its bent spider-like arms were on either side of me, and it pushed its face closer to mine. All I could see were its rotten, pale face, and behind it, a dark abyss. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The screams must have deafened me, but I pushed my head into the elevator door and closed my eyes tightly as it got closer. I could feel a cold breath brush my cheeks. I suddenly fell backwards, and my head fell onto the floor of the elevator. I looked up to see another nurse, May, looking down at me confused. She saw that I was white as a sheet and quickly got down to examine me. Blood was trickling out of my nose and ears, and tears were gushing out of my eyes. I could barely speak. All that came out were cries. I looked towards the hallway, and it was dimly lit with all the doors closed. May rushed me out of there and had a doctor go out of his way to look at me. I had to take a week off work. I was a complete mess, and when I finally recovered, I vowed to never speak of it again. Out of sight, out of mind. I never saw that figure again. There's whispers, of course, from the staff saying that I saw a ghost. I'm just too afraid to admit to what I saw. What scares me the most is that it was just one story. There are many, many more that are echoing through this hospital, and I'm terrified to see the worst of them. I saw hell in the hospital's west wing. Stories are powerful things, a collection of words that can conjure up fantastical images within your mind. If I'm able to describe the bright, pulpy inside of a perfectly chilled lemon slice on a hot day and have you bite it, would you be able to feel it on your tongue? A while back, I told you a story of what I saw in the hospital hallway and described what I saw that day exactly how I remembered it. Could you imagine the fear I felt that night? Was it some kind of hallucination created from hearing about those damn stories? I didn't think I was going to live that night, and I sure as hell didn't imagine I'd ever go back to work after that. But how could I abandon my livelihood? Call me crazy. For sure, you can call me dumb, but I didn't want to give up on being a nurse. I refused to let some ghost stories, some monstrosities keep me from helping people. Maybe I could have said that, but in all honesty, something in the back of my mind kept resurfacing. A single thought came to me every night I was away from the hospital. If that story was real, how many others were there? I ended up taking a couple weeks off, and when I came back to the night shift as a floater nurse, meaning I'd be placed to where I was needed instead of assigned to that one area. So I spent a few nights on one of the floors of our west wing, another area with a bad reputation. You see, the west wing holds long-term care patients, meaning patients who usually have chronic illnesses or disabilities that prevent them from taking care of themselves. Most of our patients that come here are usually the elderly, and for some reason, almost every single patient that comes to the west wing dies. There's an old story about the west wing involving a doctor that used to work here decades ago. Dr. Stanton was a kind and loving man, regarded as the best pediatrician that had ever set foot inside of this hospital. Any child that was in his care would surely be cured of their ailments. Even babies on the brink of death would miraculously be healed by his hands. He treated every patient as if they were his own children. Everyone loved him, but that wasn't always the case. Before he was regarded as a miracle worker with a successful career, he was in absolute despair. Dr. Stanton was far from being an incompetent, but during those times, the survival rate of children, especially those with severe illnesses, were low due to the lack of knowledge and resources. Dr. Stanton just couldn't save those children with what he had at his disposal, and he would go mad with grief after each failed procedure. The only thing that kept Dr. Stanton going were his two young children, Tabitha, age 6, and Harold, age 8. They were the lights of his life, and he had been taking care of them ever since his wife died while giving birth to young Tabitha. It was those three against all odds, and they loved each other deeply, but love just wasn't enough. Suddenly, both of the children fell ill. They suffered from seizures, rashes, and intense pain. Eventually, they died under Dr. Stanton's care. The good doctor was unfazed by the death of his children. He buried himself with work, and they say with pure determination he was able to overcome it all. Ever since the death of his children, he was able to cure his patients without any complications. Thus, the tale of Dr. Stanton, the bringer of miracles to children, was born. But here's the story of what they really say happened. They say Dr. Stanton had gone mad because his repeated failures were too much, and the weight of those young deaths were crushing him. He had lost all will to live until he was approached one night in his dreams by someone, something. This being offered him the ability to heal any child he placed his hands on, but he would need to offer something in return. The good Dr. Stanton did not hesitate. He believed that the sacrifice of a few would be necessary to save many more, so he offered up his children to the being, making them succumb to the horrible ailments until they were finally taken. The doctor truly believed that what he did was the right thing, until the being had asked for more. That was when Dr. Stanton had offered the being something else. If he were to keep his ability to heal the young, the being could have free reign over the souls of the old. Dr. Stanton thought the old would die anyway. Their sacrifice for the children would be a noble one, and preyed on the old while young lives were being saved. Dr. Stanton cured children up until the day he became an old man himself. The being that he had made those deals with eventually took his old soul, thus the story of the West Wing. Even to this day, that being continues to feast upon the souls of the poor elderly souls. When I first heard that story, I laughed at how silly it was, but sure enough, after some research, there was indeed a Dr. Stanton that was a pediatrician here. I thought the stories were crazy until I had the experience in the hallway that night. So when I heard I was assigned the night shift at the West Wing, my heart nearly dropped out of my chest. I was working for almost a month and I had no incidents during my time there so far. I felt great. My patients were all elderly, but they were all so kind. One of them, Dorothy, was my absolute favorite. Dorothy was such an amazing person. She'd give Betty White a run for her money. Whenever I came to dress and wash her, we'd always have the best conversations. Honestly, she reminded me of my own grandmother, and she had always called me Little Sarah. Every time I saw her, she would melt my heart and remind me that this job was worth doing. I'd even visit her on my off days. She was such a treasure. It was one night when I was at the start of my shift. We didn't have many patients in long-term care, so I was able to take my time with my rounds. When I got to Dorothy's room, she was lying in bed listening to some old jazz music on a small radio I had brought for her. She had turned to smile at me, and it'd be hard to believe a woman as bright as her wasn't in her best condition. "Little Sarah, how's your night going?" Dorothy asked. "Oh, you know, same old, same old. Nothing really going on tonight." She grabbed my hand. "Don't work too hard, okay? Don't let this place swallow you whole either. Keep that light in you shining bright," she said as she tightened her grip. I placed my hand on hers and assured her, "No way, this place can't handle me." I returned her warm smile. Dorothy grinned. "That's my girl." She patted my hand as she chuckled. "Go on, hurry." I laughed as I made my way out of her room, the sound of soft jazz fading away as I walked down the hallway. I continued my rounds to a couple other patients. The night was uneventful. I looked at the clock and counted the minutes until I went back to check on everyone again. The other nurse I was with asked if she could go outside for a moment. Her sister was having a baby, so she was trying to keep tabs on her. I didn't mind at all, and she thanked me and stepped out for a bit. I sat at the nurse's station. The hallway lights began to dim for the night, and it was incredibly quiet. I looked at my clock and saw that it was a little after 1 a.m. I tried to pass the time by getting ahead of some of the paperwork when I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, Sure enough, I was the only one here, but it felt as though someone was looking at me. I slowly got up from my seat and looked down the hallway. The memory of what I saw in that hallway that night filled me with dread. I suddenly felt cold as goosebumps began to rise from my flesh. It was the middle of spring, and I felt so cold that I started to shiver. I gritted my teeth to prevent them from chattering, and my eyes began to burn from the chilled air. I stepped out of the nurse's station and stared into the dim hallway. I tried to steady my breathing. My exhales were bursts of white mist in front of me. I heard music coming from Dorothy's room. The faint sound of jazz that I've come to love was now making me anxious. I made my way down the dimly lit hall. With every step I took closer towards Dorothy's room, the music became more and more distorted. The jazz that I heard was morphing into some discordant mix of garbled noise and static. I finally made it to her door. It was left ajar with a faint white light creeping from her room. I slowly pushed the door open, and as my head went past the threshold, it felt as though my fingers were going to freeze off. A burning chill shot up my arm, and I pulled back as the door swung open. A yelp escaped my lips as I stumbled backwards. I looked into the room, and I saw something at the foot of Dorothy's bed. The shape of a thin man standing at the end of Dorothy's bed. The white light from over her was illuminating it plain as day. The longer I stared at it, I saw more and more of its horrifying features. It must have been close to 6 feet tall. Whatever this thing was, it just loomed over the foot of Dorothy's bed. It just stood there, completely nude. Its pale skin was pulled tight over its thin frame. It was so skinny that I could see the details of each bone in its body. It looked like I was staring at some sort of skeleton made of white flesh. I tried to let out a scream, but it was like my throat was frozen shut. I looked at its face and saw nothing, almost nothing. Its head was bald, but its skin was pulled tightly over it. I could see the indents of its skin where eye sockets and a mouth should be, but nothing. It was like someone put a sheer white sheet over a broken skull. The thin creature began to lift itself onto Dorothy's bed. Every moment, its joints looked so unnatural, so forced. I couldn't let that thing get to Dorothy, so I just pushed myself through the door. My body felt as if it was going to freeze solid, but I managed to force myself into the room. The sound of the radio began to fill my ears, but it was the sound of pure static. I looked towards the bed and saw Dorothy lying on her bed, staring at the creature with wide eyes full of terror. I was finally able to let out a yell that broke through the static. I yelled at the creature to stop. I just stared at it, readying myself to fend off this thing. Its back was towards me, and I could see each of its vertebrae jutting out through its cadaver-like skin. The sound of static was gone. We were all motionless in that cold room. Its head began to turn, and it looked over at me over its shoulder. It looked towards me with the skin-covered eye sockets. Its mouth was opening beneath its skin, and it opened wider and wider and wider. Its bony jaw opened, and the skin over its mouth began to tear. The gash fully revealed its mouth as it let out a deep, white exhale. I saw a forked tongue emerge from the darkness of its mouth, and a cracking noise erupted from its throat. At first, I thought it sounded like clicking noises, until I finally realized it was just chuckling at me. I was standing there in fear, unable to move. It didn't see me as a threat at all. The creature turned towards Dorothy. She just stared at it in frozen horror with her mouth agape, in a silent scream. It continued its disgusting, clicking chuckle as it pressed itself over her. I struggled to move forward, but something was holding me back. I looked down and saw 2 small childlike shadows grab hold of my legs. I tried my hardest to move, but their strength was immense despite their small figure. The creature's face crept closer towards hers. I stood there helplessly as I saw tears stream down her cheeks. I tried again to scream for someone to come and help us, but it felt as though a hand wrapped around my mouth. I tried to turn to see who or what it was, but I couldn't see anything. The creature's open mouth was over her, and its forked tongue began to go inside Dorothy's mouth. She let out a quiet yelp of pain, and her body began to writhe and convulse. The creature's body began to twitch as if it were using the whole body to swallow something. Dorothy's eyes started to go white. Her skin began to drain of its color, and I could see her bones through her frail skin. This thing, its skin began to stretch out, like a fleshy balloon expanding as it sucked the life out of my dear friend. The light that shone so brightly in her eyes was now completely gone, and her body fell limp as the creature leapt off of her bed. Its shape was now different, healthier, as it simply walked past me into the hallway. The cold air that froze my body began to dissipate, as if it came from the creature itself. I heard its footsteps fade away into the night. Whatever held me down, whatever silenced me was gone now too, and my body collapsed onto the floor. I slowly clambered onto Dorothy's bedside, and I saw her. I looked into her lifeless eyes, and I placed a hand on her to check her vitals. She was gone. I stood there and silently sobbed as the radio crackled and drowned my cries with a crescendo of jazz. Time had passed. I made the reports. I finished my rounds and I returned home. As soon as I got home and closed the front door, I just crashed onto the floor. There was nothing I could do to stop it. Another story was true. Whatever that thing was some demon that took the life, the soul, out of the elderly victims. It didn't want me. It didn't fear me. I couldn't do anything. All I can do is remember Dorothy's words. Did she know it was coming? I made my way to my bedroom and stared at my mattress. The memory of that night's events filled me with sadness, with fear. I'll keep everyone updated on the other stories of the hospital. And hopefully, I won't have to witness another thing like that. Thank you all again for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed. Again, check the description for links to DarkHeroXX's stories and socials. But until next time, remember, just because you couldn't see it, doesn't mean it wasn't watching you.